So we're going to talk about reasoning here. It's a process of critical thinking about something in a logical way in order to form some kind of conclusion or judgment. All right. Now there are two camps of reasoning. One is the deductive camp, and the other one is the inductive camp. And then all the kinds of reasoning we're going to talk about can be maybe dovetailed into one or both of these areas, and it all depends on obviously what the item is that we're talking about. So let's talk about deductive reasoning first. This is kind of looking at the sum of the parts to see the whole of the situation. It's a premise that's based on fact. So let's take some facts like rising CO2 levels and then rising sea levels, global temperatures, rising ocean temperatures. These are all numbers. These facts can all be duplicated in research, okay? And the conclusion based on those facts, the deductive conclusion can be that some kind of climate change is going on. The inductive process goes through and takes a look at things. It's a premise based on observations. So we can see the sloughing of ice sheets happening in the polar ice caps. We can see altered migratory bird patterns and animal patterns. We can feel warmer seasons. And all of these observations can lead to a conclusion that perhaps there's some kind of climate change going on. Reasoning is peculiar because it can go through and be cogent, meaning it can be sound, or it can fall apart, meaning it's fallacious reasoning. And an aside here, as I go through these things, you're probably going to scratch your head and go through and say, gee, Eric, I think you have a few biases here in terms of what's going on. And granted, I'll cop to any bias that might be out there. But where I'm coming from is a standpoint of both inductive and deductive reasoning with these examples that I'm putting out to you. If you have a knee-jerk reaction to what I'm talking about, it might be time for you to go through and maybe examine where those reactions come from. So there are a number of different types of reasoning that can be both cogent and fallacious, and we're going to talk about these over the course of the next few minutes. The first one is parallel reasoning, and then we'll get into reasoning through generalization, reasoning through definition. We'll get into symptomatic reasoning, causal reasoning, reasoning from a dilemma, and lastly, arguing from authority, my least favorite one. So let's get into this idea of parallel reasoning. This is Rand Paul, who says that young people should treat offers of free college like heroin. So the parallel reasoning here is free college, heroin. All right. Now, the former Republican presidential candidate and Kentucky senator made comments arguing that America's youth, like you, should think about what is free and what is a drug, an addicting drug like heroin. I'm not seeing the correlation going on here. Maybe we will here eventually. He says, the main thing I would say is that nothing's free. Paul said, if someone offers you something for free, treat it as if they're offering you heroin and think about the repercussions of what is free and what is a drug, an addicting drug like heroin, and the ramifications of that. And the reason why I growl at the end of that is because this is not cogent reasoning, because there is nothing that ties the idea of free college to heroin. It's not addictive, it's not illegal, and so on. The problem that's going on here is the idea that nothing's free. What's interesting about this premise is that no one has ever said that tuition for college students would be free. It would be free to the students, but there obviously is going to be some cost. In fact, the costs for this spread out over a 10-year period of time per student, per household, per taxpayer boils down to, for 4 years of tuition-free college, okay, boils down to $87 a year increase in taxes. Parallel reasoning more often is called analogous reasoning, and it's used for comparison. And since similar circumstances may have similar outcomes, parallel reasoning can very adequately or persuasively lead one to assume or predict outcomes. And we use this to compare and contrast, using what we know to help others understand what they don't. And parallel reasoning uses literal analogies and figurative analogies to make that point. Persuasion, in fact, the most powerful points of persuasion are based on those types of analogies. The syntax, the words used in that kind of argumentation are words like, or as, or similar, or resembles, or compared to, or by contrast. Okay? The problem with these is that this reasoning becomes fallacious when the analogy does not make the connection. It becomes what's called a false analogy, or what we call the apples to oranges mistake. Somebody made one of these mistakes here not too long ago. It was Curt Schilling, ESPN's baseball commentator. He posted a disgusting photo and caption on Facebook in regards to access to public facilities for transgender people. Curt Schilling paid the price for that, since he was just indicating that he was simply posting his opinion, and that probably is the entire problem with this, is that it's just an opinion. And while we're all free to go through and have opinions, when you put it out there as an assertion or fact, it plays into stereotypes and prejudices, and it goes through. Let me introduce you to Ben Meltzer. He's a bodybuilder and a model, and he'll go down in history as the first transgender man to appear on the cover of Men's Health magazine. Yeah, Ben used to be a woman. Now imagine if Ben were constrained to go to the restroom based on the gender that was indicated on his birth certificate. Can you see what kind of issues might be popping up there? And that's one of the issues, one of the many issues of this, the whole concept of the false analogy that goes on. Sometimes generalizations are drawn from extended parallel reasoning. Generalizations involve making predictions or classifications and descriptions. It's also called reasoning by example. So, for example, I moved from Utah years ago to go and work for a production studio in North Carolina. And when people found out that I was from Utah, then they generalized that I must be a Latter-day Saint. And when I admitted that I was, then they generalized that I must be a polygamist. They asked me how many wives I had. In fact, they didn't even ask me if I was a polygamist. They just asked me how many wives I had. The problem with this is that generalization is discriminative. Okay, it's reasoning that what is true about one member of a group is true about the rest. It's reasoning about what's true about a stereotype is true about the entire group. The wording to this kind of argumentation or to this kind of reasoning includes like it is generally so, or it is usually so, or is normally so, or we have concluded. This becomes a hasty generalization when there are too few cases counted toward the generalization. So what happens is that we end up jumping to conclusions. Reasoning by definition is breaking down something by what it means, and this is a deductive process. And the syntax here is that it follows that, or it is necessarily so, or so by definition. So we've had this argument here a couple of years ago about marriage. How do we define marriage? It is necessarily defined as by a union between a man and a woman, or it follows that it's a union between a man and a woman. So by definition, marriage is between a man and a woman. The problem with that is that this has become what's called a sweeping generalization, or the sweeping generalization fallacy, when the definition is too rigid to include relevant exceptions. And one of those relevant exceptions is that maybe marriage ought to include a union between two people who are in love and leave the gender out of that. Now, that's where that argumentation has come from in terms of trying to go through and look at or redefine what marriage might be. Fallacious syntax includes terms of extreme, words like always and never and in every case, certainly, necessarily, categorically. These are all terms with no wiggle room. And I would argue, I'm going to use a term with no wiggle room, any argument is not pat in that respect. That is not a fact-based argument. When we start using terms of extreme, we really start painting ourselves into a corner that we can't argue out of. All right, the next one is symptomatic reasoning. This is reasoning by a sign. I call it symptomatic reasoning. And it's recognizing how certain artifacts or actions are associated with related events. So we've had this outbreak of the Zika virus in Central America, a virus that's spread by mosquito bites. And the symptoms of the Zika virus include a fever, a rash, a skin rash, red eyes, headache, and fatigue. And but it's not to be confused with what the virus results in. Okay, this isn't a symptom. This is what it results in, and it results in what's called microcephaly, and that means that women who are pregnant who are infected by the Zika virus, who have then these symptoms, they're running a high risk of having a child born with a very small brain size, microcephaly. The head size is shrunken down. So we can go through and look at a number of symptoms, and based on those symptoms, we can go through and maybe predict what's going on in related events. Okay, so symptomatic reasoning. This is inductive reasoning. It's very close to what we call causal reasoning. This becomes false reasoning when false signs are used to go through and make a link between indications and correlating events, and that fails. Okay, superstitions, for example, are typical false signs. Here's some false signs. Well, he's a Muslim, he's a socialist, he's a Bolshevik, he's a Nazi, he's an alien, he's an American. This drives me crazy, because what this kind of rhetoric does, is it obliterates the ability to objectively see what truly is symptomatic of leadership. And that brings me to probably one of the most ubiquitous types of reasoning that's out there. It's called causal reasoning, cause and effect reasoning. One thing leads to another. And the syntax to this kind of reasoning includes words like causes and leads to and produces and activates and provokes and generates and brings about and results in. A causal link has to be proven with a specific agent of cause. Now, I have this image up here of the atomic testing of a bomb called Dirty Harry. And this testing was done about 113 miles to the southwest of St. George. And when Dirty Harry was detonated, it created an enormous cloud of radioactive dust. And that radioactive dust happened to drift over southern Utah. Not just southern Utah, it went right up along the Wasatch Front, and it turned right at about Wyoming and drifted all the way to where they found radioactive fallout related to the Dirty Harry explosion as far east as Maine, okay, to give you an idea. And as you can imagine, a number of people got sick, got cancer from what was going on. The milk became contaminated, and there was all kinds of cancerous outbreaks that were happening, especially in the very concentrated population, small population of St. George. One fallacy with this cause and effect was an oversimplification of what caused the cancer among the people there. Folks who became what were called downwinders. While there was an unusually high level of cancer breaking out in the area, pathologically, the cancers cannot be related back to what's happening in terms of radioactivity. I produced a documentary on this and talked to a lot of experts. One expert who spent his entire life getting his PhD is studying the effects of radioactive poisoning and fallout and what that does to individuals. And while it wreaks havoc physiologically with people, one thing it does not do, or one thing that we cannot create a link to, is cancer. There's no link. There's nothing that proves that it creates cancer, different types of cancer, from skin cancer to breast cancer to testicular cancer and so on. Um, and it became an oversimplification, kind of a forest for the trees kind of thing, that since all these people in southern Utah were getting sick, and since they were exposed to the radiation, then that must have something to do with the above ground nuclear explosion testing that was happening. And the fallacy we get into there is correlation versus causation. That's where we're connecting two events due to their proximity. This went all the way to Utah Supreme Court. In fact, a number of people got together. They filed a class action suit, the Downwinders, against the United States government, saying that this above ground nuclear testing was the cause of the different types of cancers that people were getting in the southern Utah area. I know these people. I've interviewed them. Some of them are dear friends of mine. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs of this class action suit. And the United States government, the federal government, came back to the state of Utah and overturned that ruling, indicating that the above ground nuclear testing was done for the benefit of the country and therefore exempted the United States from being sued. So the case was thrown out. Now, we decided to investigate this, and I had a number of students working on this to make a different correlation. What made all these people in southern Utah sick? What made them get cancer? Certain types of cancer, like pediatric onset leukemia. This type of cancer breaks out in clusters where kids, a dozen or so, all come down with the leukemia at the same time. And then they perish as a result. It is not a curable cancer. And in southern Utah, between into 1960s, from the 1950s and 1960s, we had many clusters of this type of leukemia breaking out. So I had a student who decided to research this and see what was causing the current outbreaks of this pediatric onset leukemia. This current outbreak, this photograph here, was from an outbreak in Fallon, Nevada. And so the student started to research what Fallon, Nevada might have in common with St. George, and she found nothing. And then she found another outbreak of a pediatric cluster leukemia that happened down in Arizona, and a third one that happened out in Massachusetts. And she was able to correlate what was going on between those three areas, between Fallon, Nevada, and Arizona and Massachusetts, and that there were high concentrations of mercury and arsenic and tungsten. And she also discovered that those concentrations of those heavy metals came from mining. It came from silver mining. Much like the silver mines just below Pine Valley Mountain in Silver Reef, Utah, which also happens to be at the water table for the water of the people who live in St. George. So a correlation here, and we've kind of put this on the back shelf because we didn't have the funds to go through and continue to research this. But the correlation here could be made that, well, these individuals weren't getting sick necessarily from what was happening in terms of the radioactive fallout. They were getting sick from the water coming through the aquifers that were polluted with tungsten and arsenic and mercury. Causation versus correlation. The next type of reasoning is reasoning from a dilemma. It's the either or position of reasoning. You've heard this before. If you're not with us, you're against us. This is an image from an attack in Syria. And the dilemma we had in terms of going in and militarily helping out what was going on in Syria was that it's kind of a long story, I'll try to abbreviate this. You had the bad guy, Assad and his regime, the president of Syria, who was putting down the population, the rebels of Syria. The rebels needed help. They didn't have the military to go through and back them up. They turned to the United States, and the United States said, well, I don't know, we're not too sure about this. So they turned to some of their neighbors who gladly decided to go through and help them out, and their neighbors happened to be affiliated with terrorists. And then they needed more help, asking again for the United States. And so the dilemma came to, well, do we fight one set of terrorists, the Assad regime, by joining forces with Al Qaeda or with what eventually became the Islamic State. This became the dilemma and became the reason why the United States decided not to get involved in that fight. The syntax here in this type of verbiage includes words like either, or must choose between. It gets into pros and cons, costs and gains. The problem with this kind of reasoning is it forces a dichotomy. It forces an either or position. And not everything is either for or against that proposition. Okay? When we look at what's happening in terms of policing across the United States, there's a very popular notion that says, well, all police are becoming militarized. They're either militarized or they're not. And that's not the case. And that's what's forcing the dichotomy in what's going on here. All right, well, the last area of reasoning is what's called arguing from authority. And this guy here, I'm hoping you might recognize him. You probably don't, but his name is Edward R. Murrow. And Edward R. Murrow was one of the first television journalists. He worked for CBS and really was the mentor to another journalist who came along more in my time period, a guy by the name of Walter Cronkite. And Walter Cronkite, at the end of every evening's news, would go through and conclude by saying, and that's the way it is. And we believed Walter Cronkite because we felt that we were becoming well informed, that there was an authority out there, that fourth estate, the estate of journalism, the checks and balances on our government, on our foreign policy, on the people, on the social programs, on everything that's going on around us. We felt that there was an authority that would go through and tell us like it was, okay? And so that being the case, when we had pundits like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite going out and telling us this is what's going on, we didn't have any reason to believe otherwise, okay? Because they were researched, they had qualifications, they went through and backed up what it was that they were saying. There was a journalistic code of ethics, of integrity that was driving that fourth estate in order for us to become well informed. And that's certainly not the case anymore. We're not a great nation because we no longer adhere to those tenets of becoming well informed. Syntax here for arguing from authority includes words like in the words of, or according to, or as was established by, or studies show, or research shows. The problem with all these is that not all sources that put out this kind of stuff are valid authorities. In fact, social media and the internet have poisoned that pool, really. And while we certainly can find valid authorities, solid sources online, and they exist, they're out there, it's too easy, it's way too easy for us to go through and default to sources that are not, that are fabricated, that are made up, to sources that are just plain charismatic. Anymore, it's been charisma that builds this false appeal of authority. There's no substance behind it. And that's becoming a little disconcerting. It turns into what's called an appeal of authority. Remember, there's always room to question even the brightest in the field. We must all question authority. Blind obedience to authority is not critical thinking. It's not reasoning. It's just following along blindly. Don't get me started on that.